know
For
who's
sure.
going to come. You know, it's kind of the coffee house vibe. I've been using your description a lot because I think that's a perfect way to put it. So thank you for that.
For sure. I was staying up late last night because I couldn't sleep, and I had an epiphany. Well, I don't know if it would be an actual epiphany or just a subjective observation, but since I've been reading a lot of Kafka this summer, I kind of came to this realization, and I'm noticing a pattern, and the pattern I'm kind of noticing is that Kafka isn't really talking about a thing when he's talking about when he's describing all these things in his stories. He's really talking about, from what I found, is an emotion, and not just an emotion, but a very, very specific one, one that would require a complexity of many emotions together all at once. So like, for example, the metamorphosis, it's like this emotion of longing to go back somewhere, but knowing that you can never go back, and kind of having to face that reality. And then also for the kindness versus niceness in Old Leaf. And I was actually really sad that in that story, I didn't find any interpretations of it. So I was just kind of going off of my own, this is what I thought of it. That conflict between kindness versus niceness, and kindness is this more a genuine sort of wanting to give, where niceness is just pleasantness, and kind of being stuck in the middle of those two things. And there's really no way out of it to be genuinely kind. You can never let that wall of niceness down.
Right.
Otherwise, you're going to have nomads come into the kingdom and take over everything, right? And also the hunger artist, what I found in the hunger artist is that we strive to be this perfect animal-like thing. We have that feeling of wanting to be that, but then also knowing that we're never going to be that, and having that dilemma. And so I think he really pinpoints those very, very specific emotions that we feel. And he just has this superhuman ability of explaining them. And I love it because it's almost like, even in the titles itself, it's like the title is explaining the emotion. And so that was the epiphany I had last night. And I really want to write a long essay about it. And I'm halfway through the castle of that story, and I know the guy is not going to make it to the castle. Like, that is my prediction. I just feel like he's not going to make it. But yeah, that's what I've been working on.
Well, that's magnificent, Sam. And Emilio, great to see you today. I've been thinking also last week, Sam, Emilio presented the idea that what if our primarily our consciousness or subject is located outside of ourselves, and that we're mainly kind of just a position that it goes through, but not predominant. And that kind of led to a whole conversation about the nature of subjectivity, the relation to objects, duration, and different things. Emilio is fantastic, and it's good to see. It makes me think of Kafka, though, in the sense that almost the characters are more so their situations than themselves, which is part of their anxiety in being like that kind of defines their subjectivity. So for example, you know, in the castle, Mr. K, you know, the situation of trying to get to a castle and going down all the streets and locating things, that almost comes to dominate him as a person and a subject, to the point where he's losing his humanity. It's almost like you have a meta-analysis of literature there, whereas the character whose dynamic is almost forced by the situation to become flat, the character then is kind of fighting that in a fascinating way. And I think Kafka in that captures something very well, because there's something about, say, one's job, especially in globalization, that tends to kind of turn you into a worker. Like if people, you know, it's kind of funny, right? We ask people, oh, what do you do? and people tend to respond with their occupation. They don't tend to say, I write poems. I tend to play with the kids. I tend to take walks. In a funny way, we actually are more so what we do in our free time than what we do for our job. I'm not saying jobs are necessarily bad, but it's just very funny how we naturally come to answer the question, who are we, in terms of like what we do in our occupation, in a manner that suggests a certain flattening that can occur precisely so that we can locate ourselves to the other. Like when the other asks, who are you? We're trying to say, oh, I'm a banker. What are we doing? We're trying to say, hey, I'm going to use a language and a label that you can recognize so that you can locate me, so that then we can meet one another. But the risk of that self-giving almost to locate is to be located somewhere you don't even really want to be, maybe, or to be located in a kind of flatland. And it's funny because the characters in Kafka are having to kind of locate themselves relative to their situation that creates this very unique emotion that I think that Kafka is constantly trying to capture. I'd be curious how you would respond to that, Sam, not to put you on the spot, but it's interesting because it's almost like that dynamic is at play.
Yeah, and it almost makes me think of emotions that exist in everydayness, emotions that we don't even think about, because when we say, well, I'm angry about that, you're almost like stepping outside of it and you're observing it. But these things that he's describing, it's like things we don't even think of. And we just do, right? And I mean, I don't know if it's right, but that's just what I'm kind of observing as I'm reading him.
Oh, no, I think what you're saying, where Kafka's trying to put his finger on an emotion that is not quite captured. And Sam, Jason, what a delight. Sam, it's so good to see you. This is great because Sam does so much in architecture, and Mr. Javier has just walked into the bit. Jake, there we go. How we doing, Javier? Javier, I've been going through all of Martin Buber because of you. You better frick, man. I've had to read so much this week. But it's interesting because there's something about, it would be interesting to explore actually the architecture of settings in Kafka. Where you actually have sort of like in the movie, I think about like in Inception, where when he's going through the alleyway and it kind of shrinks to suggest that it's secretly a dream the entire time in that movie Inception. There's something about the lay of the castle in Kafka, or the location of different characters of which they also are trying to respond to. And to that, there's something about where the emotion that the character is trying to express is tied up very much into the setting. And then that also, if we wanted to tie that to Martin Buber, creates the tension of how does a character in Kafka move from I, it to I, you. Because it's almost like in Kafka, because of the modern world, the architecture, the capitalist situation, in the inability to totally separate the I from the object, the subject from the surrounding, you're constantly being pushed into I-it relationships. And you have all these characters in Kafka that are kind of struggling to enter into I-you and to an expression emotion that doesn't fit simply into a single term, but in fact needs an entire novel or an entire situation to express. So I think that kind of comes to mind in what you're saying, Sam. And anyone, feel free to talk at any point. Sam is outstanding. Greener Side of Sam, I highly suggest her reflection. She's got great ones on Edgar Allan Poe. She's also a tremendous singer. Her work on Kafka's Metamorphosis is tremendous. I really suggest that. And she just did one on The Leaf that was a really good on niceness and kindness. So I really highly suggest her work.
Thank you.
It's great. I think I'm interested in what you're saying, Daniel. And I think that as Cartesian space developed for the modern mind, we kind of had this mistake that we thought of, we came to this mistake, which is that space is only that, it's only XYZ, three-dimensional res extensa. And I think that actually in fiction and fictional architectures or fictional expressions of architecture is kind of like one of the best places that you really see that architecture, space through architecture is much more than just sort of like coordinates in a three space. It's actually like there is a poetics of space. But that only comes about, I think, when you experience it in, actually, after your last net session, I started going down a Bergson hole, and I think this idea of like experiencing space in duration is really important to the experience of architecture. And like, obviously in a novel, you get a phenomenology of place. And I think that that idea of space through duration comes through more. And you also see the ways that space is linked to linguistic cognition, which allows for, you know, for meaning, significance. I think you see evidence of that in the fact that, like, when you look at the etymology of different like abstract words or words that we would associate with human meanings, it often comes metaphorically from something tangible and spatial and material. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. There's this book that did this study between the movement of Eastern and Western thinkers, and I can't remember the name of the book, but it's like this picture of a tiger. And in the Western mind, the eye goes straight to the subject and then to the context. Whereas more Eastern, I know these are problematic categories, but if we use them very generally, you know, East actually kind of goes context and then to subject. And that kind of transforms the phenomenological experience of the world. And, you know, based on that phenomenology, one would posit the different kind of designs of buildings, the different kind of stories, the different kind of ways that things would come about. I also always wonder, it's a thought I've had that I haven't written on, you know, in the language of German, it's very easy to create compound terms. You know, you can put terms together in different things. I wonder if that really helps philosophy, because, you know, Germany had a lot of philosophers, and I wonder if the ability to just very easily like compound and make new terms so that you can escape previous signification into new thought is one of the reasons why you had such an explosion of great German minds that came out. I think about that often. I know I will say that taking sign language, I took ASL for 2 years and I really loved it. I know that that had a big deal on philosophical development for me, in just how I thought about ideas in a showing manner, not just simply in the Derridian signifier and signified. And certainly, I think also in literature presenting, I like what you're saying, the poetics of architecture and also a new language. It's interesting to think that you see in the novel the relationship between language and architecture and how that can engender actually new philosophical thinking. It also does make me think, and then I'll pass it on to whoever wants to speak, it makes me think how the separation of philosophy and literature has been kind of consequential in problematic ways. You know, and that would be another topic, but all those things to me kind of relate, because you can even say, like, if you don't read literature, the architecture, the kind of architectural spaces that you occupy are limited to your actual immediacy, right? Like Linguistic, Virginia or something like that. Well, if architecture somehow has impact on how you think and how you operate, well, then that's going to limit your mind because you're not occupying alternative architectures. Now, obviously, there's the benefit of traveling. The architecture of the big T down the street is not the same as, say, the gas station, but there is a macro architecture to the said setting. And there are certain architectures, like you're saying, like in the Kafka novels, it's hard to imagine finding the before the law, a gate that I have to sit in front of and can't leave. It's hard to imagine the castle or looking under a staircase and seeing a little creature that's going to speak to me. I can't remember that story, but I always like that one. Or the Emperor's New Message. It's hard to imagine me finding myself in real life in those architectures and therefore undergoing the thinking that those architectures or situations would engender without literature. And so to me, the loss of literature in philosophy has been quite consequential.
It's really interesting that I'm in a bus, like it's actually moving and connecting with my data, and I'm hearing this, and it gives like a different meaning to the things. And one thing that for me I find really interesting that you say about language is like of course language changed like our perception of the world, but like in a very practical matter, like I just spent like a month like in on a cabin on the woods in Texas. It was like a DAO thing, and like people from all over the world like came, and one of my roommates, her name's Ming. She was born in China, but she grew up in UK since she was 7. But like when she thinks in numbers, she thinks them in Chinese. So I was like, I don't know that much about like the Chinese language, but I think like it's quite short. Like it's very grammatically different than other languages, and I found it like really interesting because she said the numbers from 1 to 10, and it was really quick. It was like, and that was it. And I was like, we timed it, and she like saying like from 1 to 10, it was like 0.7 seconds, and for me in Spanish it was 1.3 seconds. So like even like saying the numbers is like faster. So that gave me like this idea that if the words are shorter, if to communicate ideas is shorter, or like in any like given like 5 minutes in a conversation in English or in Spanish, you would say like X amount of topics per example. But if two persons are speaking Chinese, in those same 5 minutes, they will have like talked about more stuff, like at least, and even if it's just like a very like small thing, like 10%, they will have like talked about like 10% more things, or more in depth, or like maybe one extra topic or one extra thought or example of a topic, because like in those same 5 minutes, they talked about more things, which I just find like fascinating. And so yeah, and it's I don't know. So like yeah, obviously language is like such a cool topic. And actually, like the other day, funny enough, I watched Arrival. That's like a great movie about well, a slight spoiler, like the movie resolves around a language, let's say, and that language like very like directly impacts your cognition. And I had a thought with one of my roommates that was like she was like, oh, I don't believe that a language can have that much of an impact in our cognition. And I was like, why not? Like before we in some tribes, they don't know, they don't have a name for the numbers, so they can just count up to 7. So if for us, like, we would seem like alien to them in the sense that we can build like these huge structures because we have like this really weird cognition about mathematics that's like completely foreign to them. So like when we discovered the concept of zero, like those concepts are like at least as like gigantic as like the what the movie proposes that changes the cognition. So I think like in a very real way, the language we speak like obviously changes our cognition, and as you say, like in German, if you have to compound two words, it gives like more flexibility of thought, and it's like maybe it's easier to do philosophy in those languages. And I even have one professor that told me that each language has like its own characteristic that it tries to talk through. Like for example, in Spanish, like there's been like really like good novels since like the beginning. Like for example, Don Quixote, the very like big famous novels. Like philosophy in German has always been like a really like profound thing. I think he mentioned like Portuguese songs and like French, I don't know, poetry. I think English, he said, is like the language of business. Like English like invokes that certain like or like yeah, like essence. But so yeah, I don't know, like it's language is a fascinating thing. And even yeah, I'm trying to connect it back with the spaces and architecture because like, well, in a way, the words you know like influence the amount of like things and architecture you can build. I don't know. I'm going to try to simmer that thought, but yeah, I think it's just like leaving it at that because I talked a lot. It's I don't know. It's a really good topic. Yeah.
Should I go for it, Daniel?
You want me to shoot off like a firework before you start talking? Is that what we want? Yeah. Yeah, I've been reading and then I've been reading like all of Buber because of you. All right. So you need to pay me for doing that work. All right. So frick.
Yeah. Well, just to show you, just to share some like recent thoughts and things I'm still thinking through. One, I've been trying to think Buber in terms of Lacan and the mirror stage. What I found very interesting, if we take this dialogically, is that when you look at the mirror, we know that the image is not you, but this is actually a very interesting exchange because it's not I. the image is not I. So in a sense, actually the image is you, right? You cannot look at the image and say that is I. You can say that is I, but it is kind of incorrect to say that is I because the image is just you, not the current standing subject, and so on. So I think this has very fascinating implications if we think like Buber's way in response to Lacan, because the response to the subject has always been like isolated from itself, and how we respond to that. You know, how do we think the subject? Because the subject is always isolated, and so we've always been trying to answer this in terms of like the subject-object dichotomy and everything and so on. But Buber says something very fascinating in the sense that you can never say I without you, right? So I think this can have even like interesting psychological studies and significance when we think about the child and sort of like looking in the mirror, is that maybe this child has some receptivity to what Buber calls the thou, right? The you. And it has like a very, again, when we take the mirror concept seriously, right? As I draw forth, the you draws forth to me. As I draw away from the you, it draws away from me, right? So there is this nice mutual relationship going on already when we start talking about the mirror stage. And I think this actually has like some significant, again, interesting problems of its own that we could talk about and think through. That, I mean, this is what I'm still trying to think through, but I think it's very interesting reading Buber in this way and thinking Lacan through this way. The other thing that I'm like still working through is my idea of void fantasy, which has to do with my recent article on masturbation and fantasy, where actually a lot of it has to do with the void itself as fantasy, right? Like, this is going to get very crude, by the way. So like holes, right? Just the fact of being a hole for somebody else, going into the hole, into somebody, right? Like, this is like, we all have like a fascination and fantasy about going in or receiving. And so like, this is what I call like the void fantasy, but I think it has more significant relations in terms of like how we see. The funny thing is, we think about like having, just this relationship with people, but I think in reality, it's actually a relationship with the void itself. And this is what I'm going to end up calling void relations. And so void relations might have significance in the sense of, for example, a man, he may think that he is sort of being the one that is filling the void, right? But in actuality, he comes to his realization that he can never fill the void. Now, when I'm talking about filling the void, I'm not talking about sexual relations, but this can come about in his own sexual relationships, right? This can come about in that way, but actually he is having a poor relationship to the void. And the woman, for example, may have, and of course, this is obviously very like still just in thought, so don't kill me. The woman can be like, I am trying to be the void for the other, and then realizes the impossibility of being the void for the other, right? So man and woman, it doesn't have to be that dichotomous in that sense, but either on the receiving or the giving, one is trying to either become the void or fill the void, right? In both sense, they are impossible. And this is what I call void relations, right? So now we have to start thinking about how do we either overcome these void relations, or how do we have a different, I'm going to use a Heideggerian term here, turning towards those relations. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts, and I'll stop there.
I'll pass it to Jay. It makes me think, in Kafka, you have an I-it relationship that people can't escape. And it's interesting because you can't think of Gregor without thinking of the metamorphosis. It's like Gregor/metamorphosis. And it's interesting to think also, can you have I-it architecture? I think that framework is quite good. Tyler, great to see you. And Jason, it is great to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well today.
Perfect. Yeah. Hey, how are you doing?
We are doing well. We have all these wonderful people in one place at one time, Jason. So all is very well. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well. I was just reading your paper earlier, actually, again, and it's very interesting. Well, I can ask something about that, but first, I'd like to comment a bit on the language and its relationship with philosophy. Earlier, I guess we've spoken about what I will call the form of language, right? There's a language where it compacts more. There's a language where it takes less time to do calculations and so on. But what about the content of the language? What is the relationship between that and philosophy? Is, I think, the more pertinent question, right? Why does, let's call it Eastern terrible, characterization, Eastern philosophy focus more towards becoming, and let's say the Anglo-American tradition focuses more towards being? What is it about modernity, right? Why is the content of modernity like this given our environment? Yeah, second of all, this is an open question, like what about the content of philosophy is what I'm saying. Like how does that relate to, let's say, your socio-cultural, your socio-linguistic, cultural, whatever triad. Yeah, and second of all, regarding this is directly to you, Daniel. In your paper, you mentioned that this is from the suggestion of Alex Ebert, that you emphasizes the meaning of the equal sign as instead of the same as. Could you clarify that? Could you like why is that a thing? Because I wonder. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, outstanding. A few things. It is interesting to wonder why, if we speak generally, being is an emphasis on the West, because one could associate, if we associate capitalism with speed and action and doing, and Susan Cain will even talk about the West being an extrovert society in her book Quiet and different things. It's almost like if you have a lot of action, you feel like you find out you don't go anywhere. Whereas if you have more of an emphasis on, if we characterize, following Ms. Cain, kind of the East is more of an introvert culture. Of course, these are it's funny because then you get an emphasis on becoming, because it's almost like by being still, in negating action, you actually see better how everything is always becoming. Whereas if you're always becoming or moving or acting, you never actually are still enough to witness the constant becoming of things that are going on. So it's kind of interesting how that works. In the sense of a negation. In regard to that point, Mr. Ebert has brought to my attention movements in mathematics that are trying to get rid of the equal sign in favor of equivalence, because they want to argue following set theory, and I am no mathematician, so everything I say might be completely wrong, and if so, we'll cut it from the recording. But is that the equal sign, nothing ever equals. There's only equivalence. And so there's this big movement in mathematics to remove the equal sign. Now, so a lot of the work that I started on A is back from like 2008 on, I went through this whole kind of rethinking Aristotle's identity, and I would used to say, use the equal sign or getting rid of the equal sign. And then around like 2010, it was like, this really doesn't capture it. So I started doing is, but then in other papers, because it's very difficult in language to always maintain, the full equation that I like to use is parentheses A does not equal A, end of parentheses equals A does not equal A, in parentheses, 2 double apostrophes without B, and B signifies a stable being. It's really difficult to say that every single time. So one looks for simple ways to put it forth, like A/B or A equals B, and A equals B also has implications for set theory and different things. But, what Mr. Ebert was bringing forth is that the equal sign, indeed, I do not mean when I say A equals B, I mean it more akin to an equivalence, whereas as may capture that more. But this is the fun of language, right? Where we always go, it's like, no, that's over the top, you're being crazy now, and then other people are like, you're not crazy enough. But Mr. Ebert's paper, because I'm reviewing it, I'm halfway through, his paper on the mathematics of Hegel, I think is tremendous. I think it really, for me, shows that mathematics has held resources for understanding the ontoepistemology of Hegel that is not found anywhere else. Which is, of course, the great irony of this is that, and Mr. Ebert brings this up, is that Bertrand Russell thought that set theory kind of destroyed Hegelian logic, when actually Hegelian logic very much puts forth set theory, and is actually very much a dare I say, a philosophical take on set theory before set theory, which then, before passing it on to someone else, starts to I think we can start to see then why Hegel can be so difficult, because if we accept Dr. McGowan that Hegel is Freud before Freud, that's a claim, and then we also accept that there's something in the science of logic that is set theory before set theory, and topography and all these other things. Well, this may begin to start to suggest that maybe Hegel had some crazy religious experience and saw into the 30th century and was trying to articulate it with terminology and language that didn't exist. You know, that would be another discredit. But anyway, the reason for that adjustment, I would say Mr. Ebert's paper on Hegel's math will bring out, and also on the work in modern mathematics to remove the equal sign in favor of equivalence.
Interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Stuff. Yeah.
I was thinking about, Javier, what you were saying about the I-thou relationship in the mirror, how the reflection that you see, it's not an I, it's a thou or a you. Because I haven't really, like, maybe the connection should have been obvious, but it just made me think of, this is Buber's work primarily, but it made me think of a connection with a philosopher that I've been reading a lot lately, Byung-Chul Han. Just been mowing through his work. In The Expulsion of the Other, he talks a lot about sameness. Sameness sort of like kills relationships to others, or erases, expels the other, or otherness. And yeah, when you look in the mirror and you see that you looking back at you, and an I needs a thou in order to be an I, but the key point of distinction between I and thou is difference, is otherness. You know, like your reflection in the mirror, it can actually be a you. You know, it collapses to an it by the fact that it is unable to respond in ways that is in any way other than how you are, than the I. And so without any otherness, it's not a you, actually, it's just like an it. And yeah, I think that's sort of like obvious in the way that we understand looking in the mirror as like a narcissistic thing. You know, I think it's not about you, it's about an it. Not to like moralize it or anything, but yeah.
I think your point is good on that. I think what's hard about the I and thou relationship that Buber always tries to point out is that actually there's these brief moments, and I think we can apply this to the mirror in some way, because Buber shares that story in the I and thou where he looked at a cat's eyes and he experienced the thou. And I think it's possible, if Buber says that we can experience the thou through a piece of artwork or through anything else, that it is, I think, maybe even possible as a small child, to experience the thou when they first grasp the mirror of that other in that image. Of course, it is inevitable, as you said, it is inevitable that it's going to collapse into an it. But I think that collapsing is always necessary, because it's sort of like, I would always call this like the dialectic of love. Like, you always need that sort of failure, or at least that time of response, to listen and then respond, to then search out again that mutual relation over and over again, sort of like a repetition involved in that turning and trying to find the thou, or waiting for that glimpse of the thou. But yeah.
You know, it's interesting because it makes me think of Sam's work recently, where she was talking about the problem between kindness and niceness. You know, where there can be a pressure to be nice, but as a result, you get taken advantage of. Whereas at the same time, there's something about kindness that we all seek, right? Something that I find interesting with Buber, and I would be curious if thoughts on this, is there's something sometimes about the I-you that can almost be problematic, right? Like, you're looking for a you, and as a result, to follow with Sam's work, you don't put it, you're not wise, and so you get taken advantage of, right? And there's almost a way too, that another way I'm thinking about Kafka as well, is it's almost like, you know, this is a thought I'm working on, it's almost like in Kafka, you can think about characters looking for a you in a world where there's only it. or where they've lost the ability to be a you to themselves because the modern world has turned them into it. And then when they try to establish, say, a relationship with a you, maybe we can say, maybe it's the daughter in the trial of the lawyer that he goes to for help, and there's kind of some sexual tension and different things, and we can talk about Aya's hole there because you're trying to get canceled in your first net talk, Rivera. So there's this sort of looking, and when there's a look for an IU, you actually can only find an it, and you can't get there. And there's this questioning in Kafka almost of the possibility of an IU in the current modern architecture, if you will, of the modern world that has made everything an I-it. But the key also, though, is it would be too simplistic to say in Kafka, say it's because all the characters are afraid of other people. They have very good reason to put up their guard with other people because they've been taken advantage of when they don't. It's not that people avoid the IU out of, say, pure fear or pure anxiety. There's also some wisdom that can be behind it as well. So there's some complexities. I always think about, it's almost like what Buber is getting at. You have to go through Sartre to get to Buber, right? Because there's the hell is other people, there's the being in nothingness. And it's almost like I've been thinking about, and it's your fault, Javier. I've been thinking about Buber almost in terms of a phenomenological journey where you can't skip to Buber. You have to first, to get to I as you first have to go through, like, I want to say ego and it. Then the ego through, say, a Kierkegaard or a Nietzsche has to become I in it. Then through a Heidegger, it can become I in suchness. Then through a Heidegger can then maybe get to a Buber where it becomes I and you, and maybe absolute knowing is I/you. Something like that. There seems to be a phenomenological journey, a Hegelian, Humean even journey that one has to embark on, where if you skip ahead, like if you skip to I as you without going through the process of becoming for the ego to become an I, if you try to get an ego you get a disaster. You get a Kafka novel, you get taken advantage of. So those were some thoughts I had about that. And I see Mr. Barnes and Andrew has joined us. And so good to see you, Jim. Andrew, I watched the first video in the Lacan. So Andrew, everyone is doing like a very in-depth analysis of the work of Lacan. And it's very impressive. So I got through video 1 and just the details you go through. I love where you're making distinctions between Dasein and subject. I love also the point you made at one point where we tend to think of the real as the embarrassing moment in high school where we try to forget about that, but that's not what Lacan means by the real. He means something much deeper than that.
Yes, and thank you for watching and supporting as much as you can. I know that you're all busy. And Javier, it's finally great to meet you. I know you support my channel a little bit. You always like to comment on it, so it's good to see you. But yeah, so I really like how you were. I don't know what was going on in the beginning of the discussion. I totally forgot about it, but I was busy trying to actually catch up on work over here at the base before I got on
Andrew,
here.
don't worry. Yeah. We were talking about our favorite Spice Girls, NSYNC and Spice, so that's all. It's fine. So we're good now.
So, okay. Well, I really find it interesting. I haven't read Buber at all, but I really like how you're building up to this IU relationship, because this is something that is very crucial in what Lacan is trying to work through, not just this relationship, which would be imaginary relationship, the mirroring of an ego to another ego, which is something that is not only relevant in phenomenology, which is something that he becomes very critical of the Sartrean and even the Merleau-Ponty's total perception of Gestalt. He says that there's something that allows for the structuration of, an ego and the other, a mediation, and that is like language. And as you were saying about like the real, we're getting closer to understanding what he may mean by the real. And after talking with Brian Becker from Singularity as Sublimity, he was saying that there's actually a lot more in the real in Seminar 1 compared to like what people would like to think. And because retroactively going back to Seminar 1 after rereading Seminar 11, you see him kind of elaborating on things like the gaze. And rather the gaze is not so much of a physical eye looking at you, but like for example, let's say you walk into like an alley, right? The total image of it throws you into this abstract symbolic eye that's looking at you. Like we associate like a dark alley with like, something that's creepy, or like, maybe some type of serial killer will come out, just something of horror, and what that does is just it structures the symbolic other, which will create our desire or our fears based on language or not necessarily like language and words, but just overall the linguistic structures of the signifier. And last thing I'll lead off is like where he likes to play on this is like what we're really trying to break down on is the optical schema, which I find more fascinating and brilliant the more I'm understanding like how he's using this experiment of optics to kind of show in which way not only do we establish the I and you, but also how we're duped to believe that we're this I, this subject that is like has this inherent existence, but then we alienate ourselves by projecting it out onto the other because there is this sense of negativity, of lack. We just can't really grasp it.
For me, one thing that I find really interesting as kind of like a meta commentary on the topics or the things is that for like the way we communicate with each other is like right and limited, and we have all these distinctions that you like for example, if you read like a particular like difficult to understand philosopher, you're trying almost to discern what like which word means what. No, it's like, oh, did he mean like being of self or entity? What's that different? Like you can assign all these words, and you're almost like deciphering to. Yeah, you're reading through the text of a philosopher and trying to decipher what the words mean in a way. But I mean, for me that's really interesting because when one reads, yeah, like any philosopher, and you read it, and like some people, like for example, specialize in one of them. For example, they say like you specialize in Marx, and you can read like all the things he wrote, all the things, all the letters. You can go in and like try to like analyze each of his words, but I'm trying to convey the idea, but in a way, we can always try to interpret the text to our best of our ability. But I think it's almost like it becomes too much. It becomes like not useful to like the over interpretation of a text in the sense that yeah, because one of the things that for me I found really interesting is that if someone reads Freud, for example, like they will have this idea of the unconscious, of the conscious, of the psyche, etc. But like if you ask like a random person on the street, will they know those concepts? Probably not. And the interesting thing for me is learning philosophy a complex adaptive system. And I mean with this that the more complex the concepts you read or understand, the more complex your cognition, being psyche becomes. Because for me, like almost if you think about all the experience of like the psychology and the psyche and the explanations of the I and the you, and like only makes sense if you are already preoccupied with those types of problems, because a normal person in the normal like world will have like I don't know, like a romantic relationship with his or her partner, and like and if they have like for example something like really like natural as like a human species, like if they are having like sex with each other, like they're not thinking of like Freud and the desire and fulfilling the desire. They're just like in a way they're just like existing in that moment. They're not like overthinking or saying like, oh, like this desire, this signifies, or this that, or so. I find it like in so for me, like when we talk, for example, all these concepts of the I and the you and how we look at like those concepts are useful in a very real sense, in a very like practical sense, but because we've read like some stuff that has made like our cognition like more complex, and therefore we need these types of lectures to understand our like more complex psyche? Like what comes like first? Like if you like explanation of Freud is like universal for everyone, or only when you read Freud do you need Freud to understand your own psyche, kind of, you know?
Yeah, kind of maybe start thinking, Emilia, which is good. Yeah, I think the angle you're going at is important, and I think that whenever you're reading anything that influences your thought, is you have to be wary about what you're being captured by. I feel like with every piece of philosophy, politics, writing, even poetry, you know, you can end up viewing everything as a nail to be hit with the last hammer you read. And this is why everyone's like people like there's a Marxian interpretation of pretty much every single thing there is, right? There's even like a Marxian Nietzsche interpretation, which is the most oxymoronic thing I've ever heard in my entire life, but it exists. But I think, you know, as thinkers, we have to be, you know, wary of this, but also aware of the fact that it shapes who we are. Like, for example, you know, I went through an edgy teenager phase where I was obsessed with Nietzsche and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if that phase has ended or not, I'm not sure. But we go through these phases, right? And, you know, you've got to be cognizant of the fact that the latest truth you've heard might not be your kind of forever truth. And I think that's kind of the joy of thought, the joy of engaging with writing and with other people who think as well, is that we've got to acknowledge this as a continual journey as opposed to allowing ourselves to be captured, because that's, you know, that's just the way to dogmatism. And when it comes to thinking, as soon as you become a dogmatist, you're dead pretty much. Doesn't matter what's going on with your physical body. As soon as you become dogmatic in your thought, then you're gone.
I definitely agree with that. But and like I've definitely went through that Nietzschean phase as well. So like I definitely could say, and like looking at the internet and like the way philosophy has territorialized itself onto like meme culture and just social media in general, there is still that amplified Nietzschean like be this Ubermensch in a world of nihilism and just, you know, think everything is meaningless. But like I think that is also just interesting what you were saying, though. It's just like you go through these different developments, and I see it not only in myself, but like when you actually further like look at like a specific thinker, like a Lacan or like a Heidegger, or even Marx, since Marx was brought up, they all have their different modes of development to where their train of thought is fixated on something. Even Althusser kind of points out in the way that he structures like Marx, you have the epistemological break, which he says is not something historical from like, oh, you have the economic manuscripts, but you also have Grundrisse, and then he finally becomes mature Marx. No, it was more the fact that what he was working on in the theoretical aspect was an ontology of contingency rather than necessity, which negates the interpretation of the Kojevian, or I wouldn't say Kojevian because Kojev wasn't around at the time of Marx, but this totalized synthesis dialectic of Hegel, which then we get Kojev, who brings that to France, and then we have this Hegel of synthesis rather than contradiction. And bringing this back to a more like relatable note about what was going on with the I and the you think, it's like all our books that we read, in whether it's like looking at a text, whether it's going to a lecture, there's always this mediation that still leaves this split of absolute knowing and allows us to develop. And one more thing to add on your train of thought, was it Samuel? Was a thing of like, I like how you said, don't be a dogmatist and try to really go too hard in interpreting them correctly. I like the Žižekian approach of short circuiting, where it's like, take their points to a limit and see what other ideas could go through to create a path of difference. And it's almost Deleuzian, even though Zizek's anti-Deleuze in a sense, his short circuiting is very much Deleuzian to find that ontological point of difference.
No, it makes me think that there is something about where philosophy, when it's separated from story or lived experience, is problematic. This is where I think literature, philosophical literature, is quite important. Like we've mentioned Kafka a bunch of times, Walker Percy, Dostoevsky, and different things like that. And it makes me think also of Marcel Blondel on how philosophy has to be located in action as being the kind of metaphysical linchpin. And Mr. Nelson, from Becoming Conscious, we've had quite a few conversations on the need to meet a certain contingency and conditionality. conditionality in order to live philosophy, and how that conditionality also functions as a feedback loop back on the way that the philosophy is interpreted that you're living on, which changes how you act, which changes philosophy, and ergo the hermeneutical circle. And a question that I wonder about before passing it to Mr. Nelson is, how do we reach you in the Bubean sense through the hermeneutical circle? How does one reach you, the I-you relationship through the hermeneutical circle, which is that tension that Mr. Nelson and I have talked about in trying to escape, say, simple dichotomies of objectivity and subjectivity that seem to solve that problem, but actually do not. So Mr. Nelson, it's a pleasure to see you, sir.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Sorry popping in a little bit late, but yeah, I was just hearing what Samuel was saying, and it was sparking a lot in me in terms of, like, I've definitely experienced this sort of the last thing I read is always the thing that I interpret like dialogues through. And like when you're saying, like, there's a Marx interpretation for literally everything, I kind of wanted to pose a question or a curiosity of, like, you know, this is something I've been wrestling with, is like, how to like feeling that when I read something, the last thing that I read is always the frame through which I'm interpreting dialogues and everything. Then that always makes me wonder, like, have I really integrated the things that I read before that, or have I really integrated that before? And it kind of brings in this question of, like, dialectics of, like, how do I adequately sit with the dialectics of all of these different perspectives, rather than just, for me, it feels like I always struggle with, like, it's hard for me to sit with the dialectics of multiple perspectives when it feels like every time I'm like listening to a dialogue, it's just the latest perspective is the frame that I'm looking through. And then as I read something new, it's just that frame. And so I just wanted to kind of propose that in, or like infuse that into the conversation of, like, what does it look like to maybe what comes up is, maybe it's like writing. Maybe writing is a process of like working with the dialectic, and I've talked with OG Rose about that quite a bit. Or maybe it's dialogue, or maybe it's a combination of all these things, or introspection and infusing all those things into to achieve that. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say, and I'll pass it on to Javier.
Yeah, well, I think I think those are all great questions, because I've been suffering through this for a while. But I'm going to take Samuel's principle and sort of make it fall on its face in terms of, like, in my opinion, most people that are dogmatic are not dogmatic enough. I have to be so dogmatic that it eventually fails. I have to see it's failing. That's like my whole point. And so the way I look at it, like, right now I'm all about Buber, right? Why am I talking about Buber? It's because inevitably I want it to fail, even though right now I don't want it to fail. But what I need to do is I need to keep talking, thinking Buber, until finally something happens. And I'm like, okay, Buber needed something else, right? This happened to me with other thinkers, Rilke, you know, like I find Rilke to be a thinker, not just a poet. But there is something interesting about the idea that when we come across a thinker, there is a hidden statement about becoming what you already are. And I think it's fascinating, because if we ask ourselves this question, why is it that, for instance, Andrew is specifically interested in Lacan and Freud and all these other thinkers, right? Why is it that he has this specific interest, you know? And I think the same way. Why am I interested in Buber and not in Milton? Why am I having like this relationship with Buber that I can't seem to have the patience to have with Milton? And of course, every time we read a thinker, and this is, I think, what Emilio pointed out, is that it's always going to be Javier's Buber. It's never going to be Buber. It's always going to be Javier's Buber. And that's the fascinating thing about thinkers. And this is why I keep saying the sentence of like becoming what you already are, is because these Freudians, Lacans, and everything like that, it's always your version of Lacan. And of course, there's room for talking about, you know, what is the more correct interpretation and so on. And I think there's always room to say that. I'm not going to leave this to complete subjectivity here, but there is something about that pulling in of getting engaged into a thinker. And I really like engaging with a thinker until it fails. And typically you can see this failing either through the way Ethan talked about it, is like through dialogue, writing, What I like to do is I actually like to ask Cadel's question. I'd like to take the thinker that I am currently obsessed with and then do like a retroactive question and say, what would Buber say about Heidegger? You know, what would Buber say in response to Lacan, right? These are interesting questions that you can try to carry the extent of their idea into another person's philosophy, and maybe you see a failing, or maybe you come across a new discovery that surpasses both. And so, yeah, that's kind of like my response on that.
It makes me think of last week where Tyler and Mr. Ebert were speaking on this kind of question of duration or glimmers. And I think Mr. Ebert is correct that we create a hierarchy where we give something with more duration, more reality than a glimmer, when that doesn't necessarily follow. And the conversation came to this question of quality, like where we actually need to think more in terms of quality, which kind of begs the question, why does Mr. Javier find Buber a quality thinker? Why does Mr. Barnes see quality in Milton that other people do not? And it kind of begs this very interesting question on the nature of experience, to where we see quality and what is quality and why do we recognize quality? And that opens I think, a very wide question. I like this notion of reading a thinker until they fail. I think there's something interesting before I pass it on. If I walked into a business and I would see a guy unloading the trucks and I would say, hey, do you also do the tax forms? And the guy said, no. We wouldn't go, well, you're a failure then. We know that when you walk in a business that people have different specializations, different jobs. We would never expect a single worker to literally do every single function of everything in that business, because they would probably do a bad job. The business would probably fail. And yet when it comes to philosophers or thinkers, we're like, Buber, why didn't you cover like the history of economics? What the heck, man? And then we throw them against the wall or something. Like, we expect thinkers to cover everything when we would never do that with, say, work or family or anything else. And I wonder why. I think there's maybe a myth of the genius that's kind of lurking in the back, where we expect that a genius ought to have thought of everything. When, I don't know about you, I'd feel pretty good if I did a treatise on human nature like David Hume. I would be like, okay, I didn't do like the friggin' knowledge problem of Hayek, and I didn't do Dasein, but come on, man, it's a pretty good book. I feel pretty good about myself. And yet we carry that. And I actually do think, to your point, Javier, that gets in the way of reading. That hinders our ability to read. But it also simultaneously speaks on the pitfalls of over-specialization. Now, I think we can take that too far, where now everyone wants to be a generalist, but nobody's good at anything. So there's a ditch on either side of the road. I like what Dietrich McCloskey says. He says, specialize in something, but read widely. I always think that's quite nice. And by specializations, he also is kind of talking more almost about skill. Have a skill you specialize in. Maybe you specialize in psychoanalytical therapy. Maybe you specialize in creative writing. Maybe you specialize in gardening. And from that specialization of a skill, more so than a subject, one then reads widely, because a skill naturally will require a certain level of specialization of thinking as well, but it becomes more organic. Maybe I could even use the sexy term rhizome from Deleuze, because, I want to get my glass bead. But anyway, or a bingo card. You could have like a bingo card now of like, look at. Anyway, I think, so there's a ditch on either side of the road where you can overly generalize and overly specialize. I think a nice way to think about it is what you're saying, like going in until they can't go anymore, and where applying Buber would be overfitting. Like in computer science, where now you're taking a map and trying to make it equal to territory, and it will not do. You have to move on. Well, if you're overly specialized, you never move on. You never go to the next thinker, right? And what ends up happening is maybe you end up like Mr. K in The Castle, where you're trying to find in Buber the meaning of life and the answer to everything in the you. And so you never reach the castle, you never reach the you, because you're stuck on the wrong map in the wrong territory, when actually you need to transition to somewhere else. And I will add, before passing it on, is that we are always already acting. We're already in values, following Missing Axioms by Mr. Barnes. So we're always already in the middle of decisions relative to interpretations of ideas we've had, ideas we think are living according to. And if we don't think about these things and own them, and then translate them into action, we're still going to live according to values, as Mr. Barnes put forth so well in Missing Axioms. We're just not going to own them. And in fact, we'll probably be owned by them, captured. And I think that greatly contributes to the likelihood of ending up, say, in a Kafka story, or not being wise about when to be nice and, when to be kind, or when to be guarded and nice, and so on and so forth. So these things fit together.
I really like, though, how you were saying how we're already in, we're already situated, which just is something like of something that Heidegger says, like Dasein, we're thrown in, we're already in the world. And this is something that even again, going back to and this is, I guess, my specialty is psychoanalysis, but, I try to be as you were saying, You know, you could have your own specialty, but you could also be like a wide reader of things. Like, you know, never just stick with one thing. Always like pretty much expand your palate, like you would expand your palate on food. Like, don't just stick to the same food every day. But there's something interesting about that though, because like Lacan says the same thing. It's just like a baby may not be able to speak, but they're already, you know, thrown into a world of language of speaking beings. They're already in relation. And this is something that's quite different, like than like somebody like, as the term I like to use, like Chomsky bros, Chomsky Sims, people that like to like really think that, yeah, like, you know, we have this like innate capacity for language, but it's acquisition, as if like, well, I don't really have like the cognition or like the faculty of like absolute knowledge or anything, but it acquires over time as they gather little things. What Lacan is trying to say is like, we're already in referential, we're already in a system grid. So once we're thrown in, we may have, a baby may know one word, like, but they are already in the relation with the other, the symbolic other, because one word equals the totality of the symbolic structure of being caught in the so-called castle, whatever metaphor you want to use. There's no meta language to Lacan, so, you know, metaphor, but it's quite profound, because what, like, I think a funny example is like when and going back to the baby, it's like the parents are trying to like wonder like, oh, well, I wonder what their first word's gonna be, right? And then like the baby doesn't, they're like, is the baby gonna say dad or mommy? Ends up saying a curse word. It's like, shit. Well, that implies that he was actually, or the baby was actually referencing the language of the father, because the father curses a lot. So therefore there's that referential totality of being immersed in the language of the symbolic other.
It's very funny. One, Mr. Barnes, I do really appreciate missing axioms and the idea of always already being in values and using values and living according to them. And I have been exploring a thinker named Marcel Blondel that makes me think about that, but I won't get into that. It makes me think when you say that we're always already in a whole symbolic. Again, I keep bringing up Kafka's The Castle. I keep bringing up Sam's work on that because I think it is so pertinent, because it is a literary expression of ideas that these thinkers are working through, that I think without that literary expression, it becomes more difficult to grasp. It becomes more like metaphors. Metaphors are dangerous precisely because they work. They're dangerous precisely because they help you grasp things, but also give you a sense of grasping things when you're certain. But at the same time, if one knows how to use fire well, they can cook food as opposed to being burned alive. So there's something about literature as being an extended metaphor, per se, of complicated emotions, complicated situations, that makes it very, very useful, where the loss of literature, I do think, has been consequential for philosophy. That would be another topic that we've hinted on. But there's something about, we are always already in a whole symbolic. We are always already trying to get to a castle. We are always already accused of a crime that we don't know that we've committed, which is the being of a self-relating negativity, perhaps. We are always already a self-relating negativity. And so let's go find the person who set us up for this crap, you know, who's going to do it. And we never do. And we just end up getting, you know, it's funny, at the end of the trial, they kind of offer the knife to Joseph K. as if he's supposed to kill himself. That's kind of the funny structure of that. But we're always already finding ourselves in a whole world in which we are a self-relating negativity. And what are we going to do about it? You know, we are always already in a situation trying to get to a castle that we cannot get to. We are always already waking up as a bug. And I am what I am not, Iago sort of situation. And then what do we go from there? Yeah, it's very interesting to think of this always already in a kind of whole. You're always already in a whole symbolic order. You're always already in the middle of a story. And then you lack the intellectual capacities to conceptualize the whole. You lack the intellectual capacity to make a map that equals the territory. And so right there's a kind of story, a kind of tension, a kind of journey that you find yourself in the middle in, because you're already in some kind of hole that you lack the ability to create a map that equals, and yet you still have to somehow figure out how to get to the castle, or to figure out how to live with your inability to get to the castle, to figure out how to live with your inability to ever handle a full you. What does that mean? And how do you go from there?
Yeah, I think that's kind of hits on the point, right? Like we're talking about kind of seeing everything through one lens before, but this does relate to literature in the sense that, well, none of us would be talking about the trial if it was the story of Joseph K, who's told exactly why he's on trial, right? Or there's a reason why he woke up as a bug, or, you know, man walks to castle is not a very good story, basically. There's a reason for that. Like if we had the single hammer with which to approach all our problems, you know, life almost wouldn't be worth living, would it? Like the meaning for life is almost found in the tension of our inadequacies, and I think that's exactly what the tension of literature is trying to express.
I was going to say that I think the beauty of literature and poetry as well, because I focus a lot on writing poetry, is that the meaning is found when it's hidden or when it hides, and you're not going to find it if it's said outright, because you're just not going to get it. It has to be described in a very certain way to understand it.
It makes me think of how the self almost has to hide in order to have meaning to itself. So there's a kind of funny way where we want to know ourselves, but the very fact that it's so difficult to do then creates meaning for ourselves. So I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, this is making me think a lot of Charles Taylor's theories of language. And he talks about a distinction between constitutive meaning and designative meaning. Designative meaning being like just X designates Y, like simple, like encoded information encoded in language, whereas constitutive language use is more like concerning things for which there is nothing to designate to. So like human meanings, love, bravery, things like that. And I think it's actually like narrative and maybe poetry, like metaphor, these things are I think are really important, because he says like when it comes to constitutive language use, like actually what we're doing is we're really sensing rightness, what he calls like an intrinsic rightness, like it's a sensual activity. And it's I think in narrative we really have more of an opportunity than maybe in discussion, but definitely in more analytical thinking, I would say, to feel if something's right. You know, like I think that's a lot of what we do when we think ethically is really we're feeling ethically, you know. And yeah, I think you kind of need stories to set up that opportunity. And then what you were saying about how it's funny because it kind of relates to the self, is I'm back on Bergson. Bergson says like the self is a durable, like it's an entity in duration, like we spatialize it all the time, but it's like in flux. And you know, a story isn't a story unless there's transformation, change, flux. Like it's in time that we tell stories, or in duration, as you know, he doesn't like time because he thinks that's the spatialization of duration, but I'll say time because it's more intuitive. But yeah, the self, he says, you know, that's also a time, an enduring, a duration-based entity. And so it seems like, yeah, of course you'd have those parallels because they kind of participate in the same entityship, sort of, yeah.
It makes me think that often we are trained to only think of feeling in response to a stimulus. You know, a stimulant, for example, my son hits me in the head with an apple. I respond to said feeling. Again, that might be too close to home. But there's something about a story where you're actually being called to feel something about a whole. Which is a more complicated thing because it involves a certain level of abstraction to hold a thing together, and then to feel something about that whole. Because I think we've been taught, and if you consider that, then it becomes very clear that there is actually in the act of emotion can be intellectualism. You know, once we get that kind of split between feeling and thinking, well, yeah, in the kind of immediate stimulant world where you're being hit in the head with an apple, and there's clearly a difference between that and say reading Bergson or something like that, then it becomes easy to separate feeling and thinking. But when you actually, what literature can teach you and story is that in order to feel what I would call a high order emotion. I make a distinction between low order causality and high order causality. In high order, basically low order is a billiard ball rolls across the table, hits another and it moves. High order is a billiard ball rolls across the table, hits another, and you remember that time you played pool with your sister and you think to call her. There is a cause and effect there, but it's high order versus low order, and it cannot be observed by any other subject than yourself. So there's a kind of high order that's going to be working on different levels of ontology and so on and so forth. So likewise, what literature would ask is that one could feel something about a whole, something bigger that is not immediately found in immediacy to stimulate you. And right there, you start actually learning if the term emotional intelligence was to mean something more than just empathy. I think that's been a problem. Emotional intelligence now just is a simile for empathy. And obviously empathy is a very powerful and important intellectual act, but there's this kind of also ability to be able to feel something about something that can only be held in mind because of the ability to apprehend a whole simultaneously and to have that sort of feeling. And it would also seem like if one cannot do that, it will be quite difficult to feel something about life as a whole, and by extension to have some kind of meaning and to therefore find a intrinsic motivation. So what you're saying makes me think about the need to complexify the idea of feelings from immediacy to a level of holding together a whole in mind.
I think what Sam brought up about narration is like, I think you were talking about this before, that there's this gap, this emotional gap, right? Like, I don't need to experience an intellectual gap. You know, someone can teach me, someone can kind of bridge it, and you can understand it. You could be like, okay, I understand it, but emotionally, there's a gap, right? You could say, oh, I feel like there's something wrong here. But what's fascinating about like stories is that stories sort of actually, it almost seems like the emotional gap actually has to be carried through. It can't succumb to some type of immediacy. As to, like, you have to go through the story to fill the emotional gap, right? It can sort of appease the emotional gap. It can fill the emotional gap. The intellectual work that is done, you'd be like, well, this is just what being is, right? You'd be like, okay, yeah, I understand that, but it's the but part that gets the emotional gap, right? And I think poetry and poetic language or anything of that sort, it carries you, it does, in my opinion, it does like a Zeno's paradox, where emotionally you go through a journey while reading the work, while or enacting the story, that it begins to sort of cultivate and nourish that emotional gap that sort of goes on. And I think that's where the thinking and the emotion kind of unite in one, because I think if it's just, I think this is probably emphasizing the importance of narration here and the story, is that if it's just an analytic work, there's always like this missing element. And I think story is what carries it together, where you could say maybe the intellectual side is more hidden. You would have to sort of extract that from Kafka and extract everything else. But the emotional side, that is an experience as you're reading the work, and that sort of fulfills itself on its own as you read it, as you enjoy it. And in that sense, you don't need to fill the emotional gap anymore. It just sort of, it's the experience of the reading it. There's the quality to it that sort of nourishes that gap, rather than if it's just an intellectual work, then you have that emotional gap of like, I understand, but and I always love hearing this when people say this, because they're like, yeah, I understand, but it just emotionally I have a problem with it. And then most people are like, well, F your emotions, man. Like, this is the truth. But there's something about narrative that, anyways, that's it.
Well, that makes me think two questions. One, is it possible to have a sense of quality without emotion, based on our conversation last time? Second, is it possible to have IU without story, or IU without emotion? But because if we say, well, the only way to get Buber's IU is with story, then one can only have the possibility of IU at risk, with the risk of possibly ending up in a Kafka story. So there always has to be a potential risk that comes with the IU. And it perhaps one of the reasons we have subconsciously divided ideas from emotion is to help ourselves believe that it's possible to have IU without the risk, without the necessity of story, which would entail necessary risk of ending up in Kafka. And perhaps we have also wanted to believe that idea, thinking and emotion can be separated, so that it would theoretically be possible to create a sense of quality that would not actually be subjective and therefore require personal participation, which would therefore be existentially potentially risky and cause anxiety. So maybe there's something on a collective subconscious level that has been making these separations to perhaps escape certain risks and anxieties and certain fears. It makes me think of this.
I've really appreciated everything that's been said. It's quite a phenomenal display of searching and then languaging. I came in halfway through, roughly. Well, looks like the ratio doesn't matter, but I came in quite late, and there was a great discussion going on. And I'm not extraordinarily well read. I recognize some of these names, but I've been trying to follow along the words that have been spoken, these ideas that have been brought up, and some of them are quite striking. And they move me a bit in that direction, but then I'm immediately pulled along to another topic, right? And there's 100 different things, and they may be related in 20 different ways. And this process of trying to catch up to something and being unable to participate in each of the pieces causes me to step back and observe it at a different layer. And so I found myself wondering, why on earth are these people gathered together in this Zoom call talking about this stuff? What is it what is the invisible quality of this? I think maybe Sam was pointing to this, Samantha. What is the invisible quality of this, the poetic aspect of this, which is a searchingness that I have in my participation with this? Why are you all here? Why am I here? All right, what is the implicit structure that is upholding all of this? It's not just in the language itself, right? It's not just the ideas conceptually. And that failure of language is the thing that I'm interested in. That hermeneutical circle, the collapse of whatever it is that we're doing in the languaging game. We're establishing nouns and verbs and adjectives. I think the finding of the you again, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with Barfield's work, but this move from original participation to final participation, this unity that we emerge out of and then kind of seek to move back towards. There's an element of that duration discussion that's brought in here again. It has something to do with the immortality that we associate with the idea of a word. It's a fixedness. And I think ultimately, if there's anything about the idea of you as a distinction from I, it has to do with the nature of will. And that nature of will is the nature of what could be otherwise. And that nature of what could be otherwise is fundamentally bounded by something as deep as death. And so our relationship to death, the end of this meeting, as it's about to happen whenever it does, right? The end of my speaking, the end of my life. What am I in the failings of my words in that moment, or in all the moments preceding, when they failed to capture what could be otherwise? And that's just some of the stuff that was floating around, and I was trying to observe the ocean of abstraction that you guys have gathered together. I felt like I was on the shore just watching all these waves undulating up and down. It was very helpful in clarifying some of my thought. So thank you.
Well, we're trying to provide a beach vacation for you, Tyler. So you get, just away, so you don't have to leave the house. What you're saying makes me think, as a thought. Sam was making the very good point on the idea that a story necessarily has to be an elongated expression to point to, in a particular conditioning with a particular word choice in a particular way, to point toward an emotion or experience or a subject or what have you that can be expressed in no other way. Which makes me think of something that Walker Percy once said about how a novel is an expression of an emotion that can be put no other way, is kind of basically what he said. And it's almost like perhaps conversations like this are kind of like that, where it's an expression of a merging of emotion and ideas that can be expressed in no other way than this quote unquote dialogos, I guess is the term that Mr. Vervaeke will use, where it's almost like it's doing something similar to the novel or the story is something that comes to mind. And it cannot be done in any other way than the doing of it. The musicality of it is a thought that comes to mind.
So this is very similar to the way I think of art. And I have really hard time using language sometimes, just because I have a hard time with categories, but I see a smear anyhow. So almost all things are art in this sense. A piece of art, an experience of art for me, is when I observe something that I know to be true, that seems utterly real to me. I can't deny that there's something there, and yet it is something I could not have created. Like, I witness it and I say to myself, I could never have made that. That had to come from whoever made that. But I recognize something in it that we share in relation. Right? Whatever it is that was formed, I feel is fundamentally an experience that I could have had or have had, and that is spoken to by that representation. And the ineffability of that, that I tend to sit on that side of it, right? I tend to use fewer words when I'm confronted by this profound experience of remembering. It's like being called back to something, and this, and yet it is something which is fundamentally felt to be outside of my capacity to produce.
It does seem that there is something irreducible about quote unquote dialogos, and that there is something about the, dare I say, architecture about the internet that makes possible these dialogos conversations that otherwise would not have been occurred, or much less likely. You know, you definitely had your Scottish Enlightenment people gathering around, you had your Bloomsbury group that had these gatherings, but you just, it was much more difficult perhaps, and perhaps it was less diverse, if I were to use that term, because you probably went to Oxford or Cambridge. So today, perhaps the internet is making possible certain interactions that cannot be reduced to a single participant in the conversation, and yet requires all of those people to be possible. So you have necessity, but also irreducibility. And that seems to be a unique possibility that the internet can engender, for all of its also risks and dangers. But perhaps it can engender those things precisely because it entails those risks and dangers. One has to invest in a risky stock if they want to get a 10-bagger, as they like to say, or something like that, or whatever the term is. Everyone, I have enjoyed this immensely. I am so glad that Javier could get himself canceled with the language of I-hole. I/hole, that was great. Also, before I forget, I did, based on last year's title, I was going to mention this, try to almost do a case study on like banging my hands on the piano and listening to the atonal and figuring out if the will moves first to find harmony, or if it's like the is it the mind that wills you toward harmony? Kind of, I'm thinking about these like Aquinas, Duns Scotus debates or different things. It's interesting. I want to do I'm trying to do like a paper on a case study of playing a piano randomly to see how process turns into event, how the brain and will naturally move from the atonal to the harmonious, even if it doesn't want to. And kind of like, it's very interesting to use an instrument as a kind of case study of the development and emergence of these different philosophical questions.
I think that'd be interesting. It presumes that you can actually produce something random, or that,
yes.
that your recognition of that randomness is on the other side of the production of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, you know, there are really strange experimental results that show that consciousness can affect random number generators.
Yes, there are. I forgot about that. Yes. Ooh.
There's well, and if you go to like the Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated reduction theory of consciousness, it's fundamentally a quantum phenomenon that's occurring in well, not just the microtubules, but probably and you can go even deeper, like the actual fluctuations, the places where choices are being made, right, where contact is occurring and then some collapse of probability has to occur. And that there's a unicity in that, right? And the eventity, to use a term, that is unique there, right? And yet it is replicable. So that's what allows for language to exist at all, I think.
I don't think I could even say the Penrose title thing without tripping up over the language. So I really salute you and how fluid that was. But no, you're exactly right. So next week we will do a random number generator. But it is very interesting that actually consciousness seems to operate on randomness even unintentionally, which does beg the question if randomness is even possible. What does that term even mean? I think that is actually a fascinating question I will have to consider. Well, everyone, I has enjoyed this immensely.